Thank you, Ro. No pressure then. Thanks. Really generous comments. Is everyone hearing me all right? That's okay? All right. Well, I'm here today, as Ross said, as a writer thinking about another writer. So not as a scholar, not as a biographer, but Katherine Mansfield on the process of short story writing fascinates me. I'll try to give you what I think is perhaps the greatest thing I can give you in the next 15, 20 minutes are her words, really, mostly her words, because she talked a lot about her own stories through her notebooks, through her diaries, through her letters. And many of you will know that her life, like the short story form itself, was incredibly compressed. She died at the age of 34. She was born 125 years ago this year, in fact, this month. So for me, she's this stunning example of someone who invested their short stories with so much life, because it was a life that she knew she wasn't going to actually have to live. Her greatest period, or the period that's of greatest interest to me, are the last 3 years of her short story writing, when she suddenly had this great new burst of work. And out of that period came really classic stories like The Garden Party, like The Daughters of the Late Colonel, At the Bay, Prelude. And she says, close to that time, she says, I do believe that the time has come for a new word, but I imagine the new word will not be spoken easily. People have never yet explored the lovely medium of prose. It is a hidden country still. I feel that so profoundly. And she just says lots of things. Partly they just pull at my heartstrings, really, but partly I'm fascinated by her sort of deep insights into the process. She says, and I'm sure many of you who write here in the audience will understand this, there is no feeling to be compared with the joy of having written and finished a story. And later she says, just to write better. Let me write better, more deeply, more largely. And again, work is the only thing that never fails. Even if people don't like my stories, I really don't mind. Perhaps they will one day, or perhaps the stories will be better. She was always really a very harsh judge of her own work. And at the end of her life, in 1923, or very close to the end, I think she was worn out. She was worn out with the tuberculosis. She also had... She suffered from gonorrhea. She had dreadful rheumatism that made her describe the act of picking up a pen as being akin to picking up a walking stick, because sometimes it was just so hard even to do the physical act of writing. But near the end, she described her stories as little birds. My little stories are like trapped birds in cages. And she was tired. She was quite worn out. And yet she wrote and wrote and wrote. And she had these moments that just remind me that I really like Katherine Mansfield. I didn't know initially if I did when I read the Claire Tomlin biography. It's a superb biography, but I wasn't sure I liked her at the end of the biography, if I'm honest. And then I went to her letters and her notebooks and journals, and gosh, I thought, I really like Katherine Mansfield. I know there's no requirement for me to like her if I admire her as a writer, but I like liking a writer I like, if that makes any kind of sense at all. And she says things like, when she's really, really ill, she says, I gave a little whistle today. And she said, it's such a good day, I could whistle. And she says, she writes to John Middleton Murray, I gave a small jump just at the window. I gave a small jump today upstairs. And they're these little surreal, she's got these wonderful oddities about her that I find really, very touching and funny as well. She died in 1923 when she ran up a set of stairs where she was staying in Switzerland, and to show her husband John Middleton Murray that she was strong enough, and she had a hemorrhage after making that run up the stairs and died. So it is very sad, but her notebooks and stories are full of life. And when I think about it, when I try to step back from all of the stories and think about what I most admire, it's it's this combination. She writes so fastidiously. In fact, she says, she says that she writes, she says, to my knowledge, there aren't any superfluous words in my stories. I mean every line. I'm a powerful stickler for form in this style of work. I hate, this is quite funny, she says, I hate the sort of license that English people give themselves to spread and flop and roll about. I feel as fastidious as though I wrote with acid. And she talks about, she refers to, say, an editor who wants to cut a few lines, and she says, they can keep their old £40 and be hanged. Shall I pick the eyes out of a story for £40? So she's absolutely fastidious. She talks about reading and listening for the music of line by line by line and testing it through and through. So I love this. For me, Mansfield, if there's one thing I really admire, it's this combination of absolute precision, line by line, you can read it and hear the music of it, but also this amazing boldness. I missed that entirely when I was first introduced to Katherine Mansfield in school when I was maybe 16, 17. And I think I was probably, as many of us were, given the garden party. I think I missed the boldness and the daring. But she combines this incredible care in the prose with these great breakout moments, these subversive moments quite often. And very often we get something like a ritual or a rite of passage, like a garden party, or like a first ball, or a death, or a family summer holiday in a kind of nice little tight frame of time. We get these sort of rituals, social rituals played out. And initially I always think, oh yes, this is the kind of surface of the ritual. But then we get these moments that just break through into strangeness, into something subversive, into something quite daring. And for that reason above, I'm really amazed still by Katherine Mansfield. Some of you might know At the Bay, the story that takes place around the family holiday. And in that passage, a mother called Linda Burnell looks down at her little two-year-old son in the midst of this very, very pleasant seaside holiday, and looks down and tells her little boy directly, I suppose he's about 3, that she doesn't love him and that she never has. She has no maternal feelings towards her children. And this sort of punch comes up through the story very unexpectedly, and yet feels entirely true when it hits the page. There's the bit in the garden party where Laura, having just been enjoying the party that she was reluctant to have because Laura's family, the Sheridans, have discovered that a man died in the lane next to their very comfortable home where they're hosting a weekend garden party. And Laura discovers this fairly brutal scene of death just across the lane. And there's a shock again that comes in. The shock isn't only that we get this very different picture than we expected when we began that story. The shock is that we go into this very grievous and dark scene of death. And then Mansfield reverses it again and turns that very sort of grim scene into something beautiful. So she just puts these terrific kicks, sort of punches of feeling into stories, and you sort of step back almost breathless with it. I'm going to read, and while I'm looking to you for time, I'm going to read from The Daughters of the Late Colonel, which is one of my favourite stories, and it was written in this great burst of creativity for Mansfield in that, I think it was written in 1921, and it's one of the stories that she most enjoyed writing. She actually loved the writing process of this story, and said near the end she was just flying through the writing because she said she was damned if she was going to die before she finished this story. She said, I was damned. So I'm going to read you just, and I mustn't kick over my water in the course of reading. I'm going to move it slightly. Okay, so I'll read you just 2 extracts, each about 3 minutes long. Let me just find my way here. So the Daughters of the Late Colonel, we have a father, the father of the house, who has just died. He was the late colonel, or he was the colonel. He is now late, and the colonel was really quite a tyrant. Josephine and Constantia are his two adult daughters who've never really had a life of anything other than his orders around the house. So it's quite a bleak situation. We have the death, and the death is set up, and the vicar visits, and so on. So I'll read you just two little bits. And again, these are the sort of subversive bits. We've had the death rituals, and then we get this. Well, at any rate, all that part of it was over, though neither of them could possibly believe that Father was never coming back. Josephine had had a moment of absolute terror at the cemetery while the coffin was lowered, to think that she and Constantia had done this thing without asking his permission. What would Father say when he found out? For he was bound to find out sooner or later. He always did. Buried? You two girls had me buried. She heard his stick thumping. Oh, what would they say? What possible excuse could they make? It sounded such an appallingly heartless thing to do. Such a wicked advantage to take of a person because he happened to be helpless at the moment. The other people seemed to treat it all as a matter of course. They were strangers. They couldn't be expected to understand that Father was the very last person for such a thing to happen to. No, the entire blame for it all would fall on her and Constantia. And the expense, she thought, stepping into the tight-buttoned cab. When she had to show him the bills, what would he say then? She heard him absolutely roaring. And do you expect me to pay for this gimcrack excursion of yours? Oh, groaned poor Josephine aloud, we shouldn't have done it, Con. And Constantia, pale as a lemon in all that blackness, said in a frightened whisper, done what, Jug? Let them bury Father like that, said Josephine, breaking down and crying into her new, queer-smelling mourning handkerchief. But what else could we have done? Asked Constantia wonderingly. We couldn't have kept him, Jug. We couldn't have kept him unburied, at any rate, not in a flat of that size. Josephine blew her nose. The cab was dreadfully stuffy. I don't know, she said forlornly. It's all so dreadful. I feel we ought to have tried, just for a short time at least, to make perfectly sure. One thing's certain. And tears sprang out again. Father will never forgive us for this, never. So that's just after the funeral. I'm going to sort of speed ahead to a little bit where the girls, after much prevarication and being bullied by both the cook and their father's old nurse, they finally summon up the nerve to go upstairs and to begin the operation of opening the door of his bedroom, which is quite a terrifying thing for them in the first place, but to go in and just to assess what needs to be done. I had better pull up a blind, said Josephine bravely. Yes, it might be a good idea, whispered Constantina. They only gave the blind a touch, but it flew up and the cord flew after, rolling around the blind stick, and the little tassel tapped as if it was trying to get free. This was too much for Constantia. Don't you think we might put it off for another day, she whispered. Why? Snapped Josephine, feeling as usual much better now that she knew for certain that Constantia was terrified. It's got to be done. But I do wish you wouldn't whisper, Con. I didn't know I was whispering, whispered Constantia. And why do you keep on staring at the bed, said Josephine, raising her voice almost defiantly. There's nothing on the bed. Oh, Jug, don't say so, said poor Connie. At any rate, not so loudly. Josephine felt herself that she had gone too far. She took a wide swerve over to the chest of drawers, put out her hand, but quickly drew it back again. Connie, she gasped, and she wheeled around and leaned with her back against the chest of drawers. Oh, Jug, what is it now? Josephine could only glare. She had the most extraordinary feeling that she had just escaped something simply awful. But how could she explain to Constantia that Father was in the chest of drawers? He was in the top drawer with his handkerchiefs and neckties, or in the next with his shirts and pajamas, or in the lowest of all with his suits. He was watching there, hidden away, just behind the door handle, ready to spring. She pulled a funny old-fashioned face at Constantia, just as she used to in the old days when she was going to cry. I can't open, she nearly wailed. No, don't, Jug, whispered Constantia earnestly. It's much better not to. Let's open anything, at any rate, not for a long time yet. But it seems so weak, said Josephine, breaking down. But why not be weak for once? Argued Constantia, whispering more fiercely. If it is weak, and her pale stare flew from the locked writing table, so safe, to the huge, glittering wardrobe, and she began to breathe in a queer, panting way. Why shouldn't we be weak for once in our lives, Jug? It's quite excusable. Let's be weak. Be weak, Jug. It's much nicer to be weak than it is to be strong. And then she did one of those amazingly bold things that she'd done about twice before in their lives. She marched over to the wardrobe, turned the key, and took it out of the lock. And held it up to Josephine, showing Josephine by her extraordinary smile that she knew what she'd done. She'd risked deliberately Father being in there among his overcoats. If the huge wardrobe had lurched forward and crashed down on Constantia, Josephine wouldn't have been more surprised. On the contrary, she would have thought it the only suitable thing to happen, but nothing happened. Only the room seemed quieter than ever, and big flakes of cold air fell on Josephine's shoulders and knees. She began to shiver. I'll stop it there. So, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Leonard Woolf, the Wolves published a story by Mansfield called A Prelude, and they were, Virginia Woolf's, her relationship with Katherine Mansfield sortitaed. It seesawed back and forth and back and forth. They were both rivals and huge admirers of each other's, and at times quite unpleasant about each other. But the Hogarth Press published Prelude, and they became increasingly interested in Mansfield's work, and also the sort of new revelation she brought them, say, about Chekhov. Mansfield was one of the first people in the English-speaking world to really read Chekhov and to understand how radical Chekhov was. When I go back to that little passage from Daughters of the Late Colonel, I love it's what Leonard Woolf said. She's an intense realist, but she's so intense a realist that it tips into surrealism. And I love Mansfield's eye on the absurd and the surreal, and that's there on both levels. In passages like that, where the dead father is locked, the key is turned to the wardrobe and locked away, and in little phrasings like the boys running across the beach twinkle like spiders. It's a really odd image, and it's quite wonderful. Or the lovely, frightening meringue, it's the lovely, frightening blancmange that sort of comes into this story with Kate, the cook, and it's trembling and it's white, and they're both quite terrified of this blancmange that's being served by the slightly fierce Kate. So her phrasing is constantly tipped from the absolutely precise, and it's almost a sort of, she has a telephoto lens in terms of her powers of observation. She really breaks the flux of flowers and light and the natural world and colour. She really gives us that amazing flux, as if we're out in the sort of natural elements. She went to the Post-Impressionist exhibition and saw the work of Van Gogh, and she said seeing that painting, or seeing, I think, 3 of his paintings, really made her understand how she wanted to loosen up her style of prose. And so what we get is still the precision, but this terrific sense of life's flux, and of we're getting detail upon detail, but what rises up through the whole of Mansfield is this sense that all is one. And there's almost this sort of, I say so, sacred vision. Certainly she talks about a visionary consciousness in which the world isn't divided, but all the details of it belong all the chaos and the mess and the flux and the beauty are all there, for example, in a story like At the Bay, which almost lifts off with its sort of own perfection. But through it, we always feel the story's in motion and it's strangely, almost pungently alive in Mansfield. There's this whole, it's shaking, it's moving, it's like the natural world itself. And for me, there's something very, very moving that comes out of reading many Mansfield stories, a sense that everything is connected, even if that is a fictional. She herself could not believe and did not believe in any afterlife, any God. She had no faith in her own immortality and afterlife, none whatsoever. But she talks about the act of writing as almost being akin to a woman lifting a blanket on a baby's face and just lifting back the little bit in a baby carriage and say, oh, look at that dear little face, bless it. And she said, I want to look at lizards and flowers and trees in the same way and say, bless it. So for me, that's the really special quality. The stories sometimes are weirdly animate, almost uncannily animate, and at other times are just infused with this absolute alertness to the detail of the world that then builds into this bigger thing that almost does feel like, for me, there's a sense of something, I don't know, bigger than all of us moving through Mansfield's stories. And I think that's what she was aspiring to in this final phase of her writing life, even though she doesn't credit herself with having achieved that. But I think she did. I think, we're there? Thank you very much. Okay.